Howdy folks, Scanner here. Thank you so much for tuning in. Now this is not a lore video. This is one of those videos where I talk absolute madness. The Last Messiah video I did where I talked about the essay, The Last Messiah, written by Zapf, the philosopher, and applying that to Trench Crusade and how I felt it was a hint at the mechanisms that the church would use to control the population in Trench Crusade. That actually did really well. So we're back, but this time we're French. We're going to talk about Jean Baudrillard and really just apply some of his thought processes to Trench Crusade. Now this one is far more complicated, so it'll expand a couple of videos, I think. Maybe 3, I'm not sure. But anyway, I've mentioned before that I like to think way too much about the things that I'm into in kind of odd ways. I like to approach my criticism of movies and TV kind of with a view of romanticism where the importance is placed on the emotional register of the work above most other things. That's the way I like to do it. I approach rap music almost entirely from the point of view of the lyricist and rock music from the point of view of the rhythm section. And it's not because I think that these things are superior. It's just because like way back in my early education, I was taught by somebody a fuck ton smarter than me that you need to have fun with things that you like. It can't all be like super serious. You cannot be up your own ass about everything forever. So for that reason, I tend to take Trench Crusade not very seriously. I get like secondhand embarrassment from everybody arguing about this shit on Twitter, if I am honest. And yet I will also take it far too seriously in that I'm honestly about to start part 1 of a multi-part series about Trench Crusade and Jean Baudrillard. So, you know, why? Because it's fun. It's fun to think about things in weird ways and challenge our understanding of the things that we like and are interested in by applying them to unusual structures. I know it's often popular to think about underlying themes and subtexts in wargaming. It's just not something that people like to do, but I've talked to enough developers and writers in the space to know that people are doing a lot of stuff subconsciously. I've chatted to folks who've spent years working on a game, and I've asked questions that made them kind of realize they were doing something or putting something in their work, or something was somehow ending up in their work that they didn't even really think about consciously, but they were able to easily connect it to their lived experience once they sat down and thought about it a little after an external prompt, which is always fascinating to me. Art, which tabletop games are, is odd, and tabletop games are odd because they attract and appeal so much to people who like systems far more than they actually like art. That doesn't stop the artistry or the themes or the subtext from existing. It just kind of means that talking about the lore and writing and world building of wargaming with any depth. Now, I'm not talking about whether you like something or which Primarch goes boom hardest. I'm just talking about the actual, like, genuine critical depth of things. It doesn't tend to exist the same way it does for books and movies and comics and even video games. And I think that's a shame because there's a lot of interesting writing in the world of wargaming, and it's nice to think about it in unusual ways. So let's look at Trench Crusade. The gates of hell open and the forces of hell flood the earth, and mankind spends 800 years fighting back against not just the physical threat of a demon sword in the taint or the mystical threat of getting fried by a goetic spell, but also the spiritual threat of temptation, suddenly made very literal and oppressive. Caravaggio, who's a painter, you'll see some of his stuff pop up during this video, he spent years and years and years exploring religious themes in a grounded and gritty style, forgoing the idealized presentations that many of the masters had used before him. Why would we not sit and think about the kinds of stuff that he might paint and would produce in a world where legitimate demons, these manifestations of the hell space, actually existed? So, for this video, I want to think about the work of Jean Baudrillard, who was worried that society was hurtling towards a state of hyper-reality where the distance between truth and meaning and people was being filled with media and images and simulations that no longer had direct or honest relationships with the things that they were supposed to represent. Very specifically, at least with regard to the thought process exercise around Trench Crusade. Baudrillard felt that modern icons and media representations had replaced God. There was an obfuscating depth of signs and representation to be waded through, and this, I think, something that is fun and interesting and pressing when thought about with regard to Trench Crusade. Now, I do want to note with Baudrillard, as with so many of these deep thinkers, he was an atheist, but he was able to appreciate and understand the nature and need, in many cases, for God within society and what that meant for culture. So I will be introducing different important aspects of exactly what it was that he thought at different points over the course of this video and future videos, and not always in the order that others might do so. But one of the most important things to keep in mind is that for Baudrillard, God as a thing and a function in society, it offered people a sort of a guarantee of meaning. So keep that in mind, because you'll need to reconsider exactly what that means in about 3 videos time. So my apologies. Anyway, for those who don't know Baudrillard at all, he was a French sociologist and philosopher, and he was, as most people like that are, interested in culture and the state of the world. He was, to be honest, he was an interesting thinker, and being born in 1929 and dying in 2007, he was one of the people who witnessed more technological upheaval than most in the course of his lifetime. When he was 10 years old, fluorescent lighting and FM radio were cutting edge, and when he died, we were sending endless streams of information around the world using actual light. So we leveled up basically quite considerably over the course of his life as a species. So we can go really deep on Baudrillard and what he thought and even why, which I'm very willing to do in part 2 if people want. But for now, let's just say he was interested in things that were not really things, and the process of replication and the failures of that attempted replication. He was obsessed with the concept and importance of what is called difference. Difference in philosophical circles is more than just a thing not being the same as another thing, but also the idea that a thing's nature and reality are rooted in those differences. Everything is connected and referential to other objects because we need an understanding of those objects to quantify the difference between things. Something that is rough is not smooth, and we allow the understanding and experience of roughness to help define smooth, as much as we allow the understanding and experience of smoothness to help define rough. This is like a massively fucking simplified version of the concept of difference, basically, and I know some people are probably puking into their boots, but a lot of you overcomplicate this shit, frankly. So, but I'm trying to give basically the very basics here, and just to set up where we're going, and give anyone who's interested a rough reason as to why you should probably read the guy's work. So for Baudrillard, everything is both self-referential and contains identity based in difference. And there is a good chance that some of you are already starting to figure out why I'm so interested in looking at Trench Crusade through that lens. One of Baudrillard's more famous or infamous, I guess, works is Simulacra and Simulation. This was both referenced in and heavily inspired The Matrix, which is kind of funny because Baudrillard ended up hating the way that it impacted The Matrix and thought they'd pretty much missed the point pretty fucking hard. But in the book, he kind of posits that reality can be and has been replaced by symbols and signs. And signs are, I don't mean signs as in like signposts, or signs as in signs of the times, or signs as in signs from God or anything like that. I mean signs as in the philosophical sense of signs, which are kind of things that are not the thing that they mean, essentially, is like a sign. So let's say language, right? Language all has meaning, but it's not the thing that it means. So the word cat means cat, but the word cat is not actually a cat. Are you confused? I hope so. So he was obsessed with all this shit, and simulations, of course, which is the long play. So our focus in this video, it's not going to be like the entire book or anything like that. I'm not going to even set up the necessaries to completely understand how Baudrillard would have arrived at this notion that we're going to entertain. We're just diving right into the notion. We'll come back to the basics far down the line. And that sounds backwards. It is. That's just how I like to roll. So basically, we're going to talk about the stages by which Baudrillard felt an image lost its connection to the thing that it was supposed to be representing, to reality. And via these stages of simulacra, copies are created and then become the basis of the next copies until the steps of removal are so great that there's no connection to the original, or they end up somehow flawed, or they end up jumping a load of steps in the creation process in the first place and are just completely misinformed. So the concept kind of maps out the journey from a faithful, grounded reflection to a state where symbols completely replace the real world. So the 4 stages, we're going to go through this in 3 steps. We're going to go through the 4 stages. We're going to pick a real world example of the 4 stages to try and understand it deeper. And then we're going to dive into the Trench Crusade and how it can occur there. So the 4 stages, basically, as detailed in his work Simulacra and Simulation, include what's called the first step, the reflection of reality. Well, the first stage, more about that in a second. He referred to it as the sacramental order. It's a faithful copy or image. The sign, which is that thing, acts as a clear and honest reflection of a profound underlying reality. Number 2 is the masking of reality, the order of malevolence. A distorted or perverted copy, the sign begins to alter or hint at a hidden, deeper reality, creating a good appearance that misleads the viewer. It's close but no cigar, basically. The absence of reality, the order of sorcery, a copy without an original. The sign claims to represent reality, but it masks the fact that the underlying reality no longer actually exists in that process. It becomes an arbitrary image, acting as its own reference. And then, number 4, a pure simulation or pure simulacrum, a representation that has no relation to any reality whatsoever. The sign is only reflecting of other signs, entirely unmoored from anything in the physical world or any central source of inspiration whatsoever, creating an artificial environment known as hyper-reality. Now, one of the things that we do need to consider here, at least in my view, is that they're not steps and they're not stages in the sense that you might think of as stages, but they're occurrences. They're not a sequential effect of decay that is reliant on each other, but rather they're occurrences of decay states that can happen, not just out of sequence, but completely out of step with each other. I know that some people really hone in on the idea of them as steps, but that is simply not necessary because it demands an almost esoteric level of perfect knowledge rather than how these things actually occur, which is a far more exoteric in nature. You can, in effect, be a step in the process without understanding that process or even aware that the process exists. Let's be honest here. Feel free to argue with me about this in the comment section if you wish. I honestly just don't know how long I should spend on this type of thing in this type of video to really have value to people who would primarily be interested in Trench Crusade. So let's take a look at a real world example of what it is that I am blathering on about. And I'm hopeful that most people will have an ability to understand and connect with this, as it's an easy enough concept that everyone has been exposed to, which is music. So stage 1 of music, I guess the reality is sound, right? Everything makes a sound. A hand clapping, a tree falling, a rock tumbling. There is sound. Sound is a thing that exists. And the first stage of the simulacra would be like an acoustic piano, let's say. The image that reflects reality. A piano note is a faithful image of a physical event, right? The creation of sound. There's the wooden hammer and the wire, and the key is hit and the hammer falls and the wire dongs. It is sound that exists because of the thing. It's basically the sacramental image of that notion of contact being made and sound being created. the sound, in a way, if you want to be kind of smart about it, the sound like participates in its own source. It reverberates around inside it, and you can hear things like the size of the room and how hard the key was hit and the age of the instrument. And there is a referent that exists there, basically. So stage 2 would be the electric piano. Electric pianos were ostensibly created to solve the problems inherent in pianos. It was designed to impersonate a piano, to be more portable and amplifiable and affordable in many cases, and piano shaped and piano fingered, and everything about it was a piano essentially, but it was much smaller, and inside it, instead of these strings and these hammers, it was electricity instead of air. It resembles piano playing whilst also being another thing, because the way it creates the sound is suitably different. That's where you're kind of ending up, right? You want the sounds of the keys hitting the strings, but you've created a new way to do it that doesn't involve those. So you've taken that step away. You've taken that kind of notion of the masking of reality. It sounds like a piano, yes, but it's not. It's not a piano at all. It's something very different. So stage 3 would be the synthesizer, right? A completely electronic thing that can do many things, but the patch that you're playing is designed to sound like a piano. So you've got your waveforms and your cutoffs and your resonances and your LFOs and your everything else are all tweaked and poked and prodded in order to produce a sound that sounds just like a piano. But now there's no kind of anything involved, right? It's not even a case of this thing was made to replicate a piano. This thing was made to replicate the notions of sound and how the physics of sounds react. And if we twist it and bend it and alter it all in a certain way, it can make the sound of a piano. It performs the appearance of an instrument, but it's not present. There's no actual instrument. We take it a step further, I guess, and look at like a thing that's built out of samples. So I'm not sure if many people understand the way that this would work, but people would go into a studio with a piano and they would record various strikes of the keys at different notes and chords and tones and modalities of a piano, and they would stitch all that together via sound sampling to mean that, like, I could sit here and if I did a thing, they'd have already done the thing and the sound would play. This is the kind of third type, the absence of reality. There's no longer anything even close to realness in the process. Nothing is being played anymore. There's no more kind of physicality to it all. These are just copies of sounds that will have been changed and altered and made unreal by the nature of their recording. And then after all that stuff, you get to stage 4, which is the pure simulation. That would be like, let's say, a loop pack. So a producer would buy XYZ loops. Nobody has like performed that music. They were made as product. They were cataloged by mood and BPM and key, and there's no song that exists for them. They're literally just product in every way, top to bottom, in and out. The product itself is more than likely made from the previously made patches and all that kind of stuff. It's just you're the furthest possible you can be from actual real music at that point. Nothing against people who use loops in production. There's nothing wrong with that. We're talking strictly philosophically here. We're very far away from the aim and intention of either sound or music when we're at the point of producing loop packs that need to cover potential eventualities that somebody might want. We're just doing math and not music at that point. So that would be our real life example. So let's take a look and let's take this understanding and apply it to the world of Trench Crusade. But once again, I want to just mention a couple of interesting things that we need to keep in mind here. First, we need to assume that God will be our perceived reality, right? God is sound. God is the original. He's the creator, and he's all things that come from him. He is the basis of everything, the foundation of both the divine and the profane, and the physical and the spiritual, and he is in the world of Trench Crusade, and frankly, the real world for anyone who believes in it. He's the square root of all reality. So that's the most important consideration, and it leads us to this stage, the sacramental order and the reflection of reality. So that first thing is actually man. So Baudrillard refers to it as a reflection of a profound reality, and there's no more fitting example here that man is imago Dei, right? The sacramental image, a copy that participates in the original, that carries a real trace of the thing that it actually reflects. In Trench Crusade, that's not metaphor there. It's in the actual world of Trench Crusade, let's say. Man is made by God himself in his image, as faithful an act of intent as is actually possible. But it's also the mechanics within rules. Humanity can channel grace and work miracles, and we know that kind of the saintly process is there with weight and meaning and reality. So that image of God in this setting is immeasurable, and there can be no greater reflection to that profound reality that Baudrillard hinted at than in God himself making something in his image. So is it God? No. But is it made in his image? Yes. And it must be fit for purpose as it's made by God. So the second one is actually the Metachrist, I would argue. Baudrillard kind of would describe it as masking and denaturing the profound reality. So by the creation of the Metachrist, it's man trying to produce in a way that divine element and just being completely incapable of doing it. They made like close to Christness from what we know. They made something strange and in some way rooted in some sort of twisted, messed up divinity, but because they are not God, they are unable to A, create God, or B, create the reality of God's work. So they end up in this kind of, what's the best way to describe it? That the distorted or perverted copy. And that's what they end up with. That's just part of the process. So number 3 then becomes like the communicant, right? Where they're trying to use normality as a basis for some kind of weird, messed up divinity. Baudrillard described it as an image that would mask the absence of profound reality. It's pretending to be the thing. And surely that's like the communicant in every way. It's a human who consumes the flesh of the copy to sustain somehow the powers of the original. It doesn't make any ground towards that original divinity. It's not even close to it, but it's trying to be, and it thinks that it is, and the world around it, which is the key element, is interpreting it in that way, that communicants are somehow divine and special and close to heaven. And we see that repeatedly in the lore. And they do react to this thing, like it does change them in a way, but they're no closer to the image of God. They're further from it than they have ever been, which is like every step of this thing. This is kind of where we're getting to. It's the tragedy of Trench Crusade, is that almost every step taken by man is actually removing them further and further and further and further away from what we can imagine godliness to be. And then stage 4, that disconnected, unrelated, happens in a vacuum moment of something like the Taquins, right? Pure simulacrum. They're generated from alchemy and formula, and there's no reference at all. There's nothing to go on, because it's their understanding of what life is, and it's so outside of the reality of things that it doesn't even have a soul, which we can take to be the basis of, like, man is the fact that man has its soul. It doesn't look like people. It doesn't come from anything that's close to people. It's just a person's flawed understanding of life based on their flawed understanding of the divine. It's the furthest possible thing you can get, basically. And it's people doing this thing, not hell. That's what's so funny and strange and weird. But yeah, so I think, kind of, as I said, I think that's like the real tragedy of the setting of Trench Crusade, is the nature of the need to survive is to change and to attempt to somehow control and imbibe and channel the divine, and all that will ever do is actually move people steps and steps and steps away over and over again from God, which is tragic. So this is obviously extremely literal in the world of Trench Crusade. You can apply it in an immensely literal sense, because as far as we know, God is real, and as far as we know, all these things are kind of broken out almost into the tiny, like I've talked about this before, how interesting I find it, these tiny fractious elements of the divine becoming science, and what we think of in the modern day as science being proven as being the mechanics of the divine. I just find it really interesting. So that's part one. This is all just a setup. I just want people to kind of think about these stages and whether you agree or not, and your interpretation of them. Because part two, we're technically going to get more basic, but also far more important. We're going to look into one of Baudrillard's kind of bigger notions, which was that not only had God been almost like entirely removed from society, but essentially to the point of absence, which is something that pops up repeatedly over and over again across all kinds of philosophers and philosophical thinking. But they don't mean that literally, but we can apply it literally to Trench Crusade. Have some fun with it. So let's do that next time. That's it for this video. Heaven help anyone who stuck with this shit. You guys always amaze me with your interest in the absolute lunacy that can go on inside my brain sometimes. So sound off in the comments with your thoughts. As always, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you're enjoying this summer, this period of the year, this beautiful July that we all get to experience right now, and have a great time, guys. Thank you.